Having to deliver a follow-up to the greatest selling album of all time must have been no easy feat for Michael Jackson and his team. And so it proved, as his next album, Bad, was nearly 5 years in the making, and saw Michael's sound change with the times, being heavily influenced by digital instruments and recording processes. It also saw him develop further as a producer in his own right, and ultimately see the demise of his partnership with Quincy Jones that had been so successful with Off the Wall and Thriller. The initial work on the album began in 1984, when Michael was working on Liberian Girl and Dirty Diana, initially intended for the Jacksons' Victory album. However, due to the Victory tour itself, the project was put on hold until January 1985. The album's creation continued throughout that year, with Jackson writing and recording many of the tracks at his Havenhurst home studio with the producers, musicians and engineers that came to be known as the B-Team. Jackson nicknamed his home studio at Havenhurst as the Laboratory. This place served as the creative hub where he collaborated with a select group of musicians and engineers, including Matt Forger, John Barnes, Chris Carell and Bill Bottrell. As well as working on Liberian Girl and Dirty Diana, they'd also worked on Another Part of Me for the 1986 Disney 3D. Although the team were aware of Michael's contract with Quincy as head producer for the forthcoming album, the Havenhurst team believed that they were very much there to work on the record and not to merely create demos. This did lead to a misunderstanding when Michael brought his recordings to Westlake Studios to work with the so-called A-Team of Quincy Jones, Bruce Swedien, and the studio musicians such as Greg Fillinganes, who had previously worked with Michael to great effect on Thriller. By the time Michael and the team gathered at Westlake, most of the fundamental elements of the songs were already in place, and Michael was very satisfied with what he had and the sounds they'd created. So much so that Michael wanted to further include the guys from Havenhurst while working at Westlake. Quincy apparently wasn't too enamoured with this arrangement, as he felt he was being undermined as producer. This led to Michael having to ask the Havenhurst crew to stay away from Westlake to keep the peace. This disagreement was likely the catalyst that led to Quincy not being asked back to produce Michael's next album, Dangerous. He did continue to work with the Havenhurst team, most notably with Bill Bottrell and John Barnes featuring heavily on the Dangerous album. The mid-80s really saw a shift away from the purely analogue world and into the realms of digital synthesis. The biggest player in this game were Yamaha, with their implementation of FM synthesis in their DX series of synthesizers, and the most popular by far was the DX7. Released in 1983, it quickly gained popularity due to the fact it sounded so different from anything that had gone before it. Its ability to create punchy, bright sounds captured the imagination of producers looking for an edge on the competition. The downside of this new synth style, though, was that it was notoriously hard to program. The sleek design, in keeping with the age, meant that to program it, there was a lot of menu diving on an impossibly tiny screen. As a result of this, a lot of keyboard players and producers instead relied on the provided ROM cartridges supplied by Yamaha. Quite a few of these sounds on Bad can be heard on these cartridges, including the E-Piano and E-Bass 1 on cartridge 3A. This is featured on Another Part of Me and Leave Me Alone. Another digital synthesizer that featured on the album hadn't even been officially released when they got their hands on it. The Roland D50 was a cutting-edge instrument that used linear arithmetic synthesis, combined with sampled playback and onboard effects. Elements of it can be heard on a few songs, but most noticeably on Man in the Mirror, playing the electric piano sound, plus the intro melody. Michael was very keen on having some brand new sounds created from scratch as well, in order to really stand out. This task was undertaken by Denny Yeager, Chris Carell and John Barnes on the incredible Synclavier from New England Digital. The Synclavier was a revolutionary instrument that could be used to create original sounds, manipulate existing sounds, and also store them in its computer-based hardware system. At that time in the mid-80s, the Synclavier was the reserve of the very wealthy, and a full system can set you back up to $200,000. Of course, for Michael, budget was no barrier, and he commissioned the most expansive and feature-laden model for his Havenhurst home studio. The Synclavier was cutting-edge technology that featured synthesis and sample manipulation, plus a sequencer that could sequence up to 200 tracks, so whole arrangements could be constructed on it. They even used it for effects, processing Michael's vocals through it and famously creating the heartbeat sound for Smooth Criminal, with the initial sound being Michael's own heartbeat, recorded specially by a doctor. The sounds created on the Synclavier can be heard clearly on the intro to Dirty Diana and the bass sound on Smooth Criminal, which is a low bass piano note that has been pitched up. This sound was also layered with another bass sound. They didn't just confine themselves to the very latest technology though. The Moog came out to play quite often for percussive and bass sounds in particular. Michael Bodica was a Moog whiz and created parts like the shaker in The Way You Make Me Feel by manually moving the filter dials. They quite often had subparts for the bass that would accompany the Synclavier or DX7, giving them more weight. This works really well for the title track Bad. A lot of the drum and percussion sounds seem to be created or heavily processed using the Synclavier, although listening through some of the stems, there are some very recognisable sounds, like the Lindrum for kicks and Oberheim DMX for toms. The sounds were also processed through the AMS RMX16, with other effects being used including the Yamaha Rev 5 and the Lexicon PCM70. This was favoured for its gated chamber reverb preset sound on the synthetic horn parts. The Rev 5 was used for creating width, with a favourite patch being the pitch change C. This worked by tuning the pitch down 8 cents on the left and up 8 cents on the right. These types of width effects seem to be fairly noticeable on a few of the stereo parts, especially the guitars, resulting in an out of phase beyond the speaker sound. Other notable synthesizers being used were the Roland MKS50, this was used for the bass on Man in the Mirror, the Roland JX10, the Korg DW8000 and the Oberheim OB1. Midi was being utilised as much as possible during the production, and the organ solo on Bad, played by the great Jimmy Smith, was a genuine Hammond B3, but it was specially converted to generate MIDI notes too, in order to layer synth textures. The actual solo on Bad is 2 different takes blended into one, with completely different sounds going on. Here are the unused bits. Acoustic horns and strings were also layered into the synth sounds, creating really interesting textures. Here are some examples. It wouldn't be right not to mention the most important instrument of all, Michael Jackson's voice. And not just his incredible singing either, but the whole performance, whether it be rhythmical mouth noises or his body itself. On the multitrack, you can clearly hear him clicking his fingers and stamping his feet, all of which is left in the finished track by Bruce Swedien to give it character. Here's an example. You're really turning me on. Switching from analog tape to digital tape was very much a sign of being at the cutting edge at the time, and a popular choice of recorder was the Mitsubishi X850. The X850 was introduced in late 1985 and was the result of a partnership between Mitsubishi and Otari, and records 32 digital tracks across a 1-inch wide magnetic particle tape. It featured a selectable sample rate of either 44.1 kHz or 48 kHz at a bit depth of 16 bits. The whole recording process yielded around 62 songs, and Michael was keen to release a triple album, but Quincy had other ideas, instead insisting at the record to be 10 songs or 11 if you bought the CD, and each would be of a single release quality. Michael had famously written himself a note on his bathroom mirror saying 100 million, his sales target for the album, and his hopes to double the sales of Thriller. That never quite happened, as Thriller remains the greatest selling album of all time, and Bad has always seemed to be very much in its shadow, due to Thriller's huge cultural influence and astronomical sales of 66 million to date. Bad is still one of the best-selling albums of all time though, amassing 35 million in sales, which is incredible, even by Michael Jackson standards.